Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. Now we're coming to episode 5 of the John Adams miniseries, Unite or Die. This episode picks up right after the end of the previous one. Washington's now the President of the United States, and it carries through all of his presidency some of the political turmoil that his administration had to go through, Adams' view of his role as vice president, and of course Adams being elected the second president of the United States, and which of course would be the first one-term president of the United States. Now, new additions to the cast, we got Rufus Sewell, who of course played the Count villain in The Legend of Zorro, amongst other things, as Alexander Hamilton. I know a lot of people who love that musical Hamilton will be going, "Yay, Hamilton!" Of course, those of you who don't know, he was one of Washington's younger officers during the war. So, there's that connection there and why he's there. But I don't know if I would say Hamilton is one of the better people in the administration. Although he does make a little bit of sense when he's talking about debt in this episode. You also got to think about it like, that might be true, but if you keep doing that too long, you'll just be in perpetual debt. I'll get to that when I talk about some of the quotes that are said in this episode. Now, as I said at the top of this video, it picks up a little bit into the presidency. Adams, he's a little annoyed by his role in the new government. I mean, he is, for lack of a better comparison, and pull something from Conrad Thompson, he's the assistant manager to Washington's manager, but he doesn't feel like he has that much power in that role. The main thing he does is sit and preside in the Senate, and even then the only time he has any real authority is to break a tie or to bring the Senate to order. Other than that, nothing, and he hasn't been set for anything. And Washington, as of yet, has not asked him for his counsel, which is probably a result of the negative side of the old way of electing a vice president, which is the runner-up becomes vice president. Now, you could see a pro and con to that approach, because the pro would be, if you're from different parties, as the president, you could go to your vice president and be like, alright, what are the people in your party saying we should do here? And try to find an approach that appeases both, or take some good points from one and the other. But the negative aspect is that you could run into somebody who's like, I'm just not going to deal with him. He's a Republican, I'm just not going to deal with him. He's a Democrat, I'm just not going to deal with him. Which is the main reason why we eventually got rid of that model and went to the model of president and vice president running together, and they're elected together. Though I have to admit, there are times where I try to think like what would have happened. Like, could you imagine in the 2016 election how things would have gone with Trump as president and Hillary as vice president? Oh, that would have been fun to see. Or even in the modern one, Trump being demoted to vice president under Biden as president. Oh, that would have been fun. But it's one of those things that, like, yeah, it probably would have caused more headaches than it was worth, so it's a good thing they got rid of it. But it's fun to speculate. That's the fun thing about what-ifery. Even though, as I've said before, what if are the two most dangerous words in the English language when used together. Just raises too many questions. Get back on the main point. Adams, dealing with all that, talking with his wife, talking with some other constituents about it. He's unhappy, he's not sure what to do, even though Washington's re-election is approaching at one point in the episode. He's also dealing with his own personal turmoil. His daughter, Abby, wishes to marry Colonel Smith, who is his secretary. Smith is the one that broaches it with him. And I just love how, as an actor, Giamatti just flips once this is brought up. He's all normal, but then the moment that Colonel Smith mentions, he's always like, I beg your pardon? And he just tells, like, did you just talk about my daughter? Don't you talk about my daughter? Very good reaction, because he's objecting to the match. He's like, nope. But of course, Abigail talks some sense into him when we get a lovely little wedding scene. He does send John Quincy Adams to the Netherlands as an ambassador. Little hint that the American government is seeing that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree when it comes to the son who is part of the namesake of his father being just as good as his father. But of course, from what we see, Quincy is a little bit more level-headed than John, which is probably a good thing. I mean, later on in the show, we even see John Quincy when he becomes president. Charles, though, he's the one that really gets upset with John in this one. And he does the argument that, given what has happened throughout his life, is evident that he's mad at his father for essentially choosing duty over his family. And, for the longest time, your name was just a name at the end of a letter. And you come back and like that, you lacked love, you didn't give us attention, which sadly part of that is a argument you sometimes hear in the modern era, which is sad, because at this point there's really no excuse for not giving your children the love and attention. Back then, when news would take months to travel across the ocean, you could see why Charles would be upset, but you can also understand it a bit more, especially given the times they lived in. But Charles is not wrong in feeling this way. As I said, don't tell other person how to feel, from my Ron Raymond review. You can't tell Charles that he's wrong for feeling this way. And just the way Adams just tries to blow it over. It's like, John, you gotta admit that with your younger children, you did fail them as a parent just a little bit there. Even though you were doing this for their future, you have to admit you're like that, especially whenever they try to bring something up like this, your first thing is to try to push it aside. To bring the old thing that was mainly used in 1776, there's a reason why later in his life he viewed himself as obnoxious and disliked, because it looks like he started to push some people away. This episode was Emmy nominated for sound mixing, and with a lot of scenes like that one, I can see why. Good one there. This episode does continue the political intrigue that, bound to come with this show because of the time period it takes place in. But this is the one where it's kind of subtle in some places, a little bit more in your face in others, where they bring up the different political philosophies and also the beginning formation of the parties, the Federalists versus the Republicans. And this is not the modern Republican Party. If I remember right, this is what evolved into the Democratic Party, and the Federalists are one of the older parties that I don't think are around in their older form anymore. It essentially comes down to strong central government for the Federalists versus the Republicans, who are more we the people, for the people. So pro-central government versus balance and all for the people. Which you can understand, especially back then, why that'd be a big issue. That's one of the things. That's the one that's named. The other one is more subtle and is in how the character interacts with one another in a lot of the plot. The main scene that comes to mind is when Ambassador Genet, which unfortunately I'm unable to name his actor here because IMDb doesn't even have it listed there. They probably have him improperly listed there. I didn't check Wikipedia, but Ambassador Genet trying to get America to come into the war against Britain on their side to their treaty and all that. But since this is the part where France has now entered its own revolution and, as the episode progresses, beheaded King Louis and Marie Antoinette, the American government's viewing it like, okay, we still love France, but considering that our treaty was with the king you just beheaded, and we haven't discussed a new treaty, we're going to have to stay out of it right now. Ambassador Genet gets triggered, for lack of a better term, and starts calling him out and like, you have to do this. Tread carefully, Ambassador. You will hear the word of the people and you will obey them. This is where the three models of government when it comes to a republic come in. Now, to describe that, I gotta probably explain what a republic is for those listeners who don't fully know. And this is going to come into one of those things where like, we're a democracy, and people go, we're a republic. Use the meme, well, yes, but actually no. Technically, both terms are correct, but it's general versus specific. Because technically, a republic is still a democracy. It's just a representative democracy where the people elect representatives who go and run the government, make decisions on their behalf. When most people say democracy, they're usually implying more a direct democracy is where the people vote on everything. That said, some of that does still seep into the republic, because every now and then we get stuff put on the ballot that we the people vote for, and of course referendums and other stuff like that. But a lot of the other times we still go with the representative model. Now back then you could definitely see why they used it. Nowadays there's a lot of people that say, yeah, we don't really need it as much, or try to say, well, I'm not representative. If you live in America and you have a congressman and a senator, either at the state level or higher, you're represented. If you have a city council, you're represented at that level, especially if you voted for them. It's the places that don't really have any of those that you're like, yeah, like, I know like places like Puerto Rico, they don't really get a vote for president, so in that regard they are kind of not represented, which is why I think they really need to go back and rethink how they do the electoral college when it comes to the non-states. I don't know if they don't have a senator or whatnot. I don't think they do, though, which is a shame because it's American citizens and they should have one. But that's its own topic for a whole separate video, so I'm not going to get too far off the beaten path with that tangent. But to get straightened back out and connect it back into this main point, the three models. We got the delegate model, which is vote according to the will of the voters, or in the case of the president, act according to what they all want, which kind of goes into the mob rule direction. But considering what Ambassador Janae is saying, that is what he's saying he wants them to go with. The other one is the trustee model, which is you're elected by the people. You will take their thoughts and wishes into consideration, but you will use your own reason and judgment to decide what to do. This seems to be the model that most people in Congress seem to go with, although the ones that probably take bribes are probably going to be like own reason and judgment. And then we have the Politico model, which balances the two. And which way you go is going to decide on which is served best, the nation or the constituency, which means like your own party and all that. And you got to balance which way to go. Now Washington, he seems to be treading the line between Politico and trustee, because sometimes he's going with trustee, own reason and judgment, such as later in the episode with the Jay Treaty. I mean, he even gets upset. You know, you could tell he's taking it personally that the people are burning effigies of Jay, and you know, they're protesting against him, which he is fine with. I mean, it's First Amendment. They could protest against him all they want. You could tell he's not mad about that. Adams, you could tell, is a little upset, which he complained to the next episode with the Alien and Sedition Act. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. It's just foreshadowed there. But there, he's going with the trustee, and he even says, "I don't agree with everything in that treaty, but I will defend it." Now, with Politico, and with him, he is trying to figure out which is served best. So he goes back and forth between the two. Or it seems some of the people with him want to go more with the delegate model. Like, for example, Jefferson, which is where him and Hamilton have their little point of contention, where they're discussing politics, which eventually leads to Jefferson leaving the cabinet in this episode. And the one quote that Hamilton says that kind of shows where he disagrees with Jefferson is, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary," which is true. And in that regard, I will say Jefferson is a little idealistic if he thinks that their central government should have no power. However, Hamilton is wrong in thinking that the central government should have all the power, and Adams is wrong in that regard too. It's like, you should have a central government that is strong, definitely a lot stronger than it was under the Articles of Confederation, where it was essentially just a dog with no teeth just sitting there going, "I'm going to give you money, I'll give you money, we need the money." And the government and the state governments were like, "No. Why are you going to give me the money?" "No. Why not? Why should we give you money? You have no backbone." And of course, if you have too strong a central government, the states are just going to get resentful and things could happen. I mean, even nowadays, we still got all that little tug of war between the states and the central government. So in some regards, the states are winning. Like when it comes to marijuana legalization, they seem to be winning. Because how often have you heard of a case of the federal government doing raids in states where it's legal? I mean, there might be some pushback before, but it seems like with every subsequent state, they're like, yeah. But that'll probably get to the point where the federal government will have no choice but to make it legal, because you can't sit there and say if all 50 states make it legal, then no, it's still illegal. That's just being a closed-minded pushback for the sake of being a closed-minded pushback. The other point of contention ties into that, and that is the need for a strong central bank, which time and time again has shown probably not the best idea with how they've had to been bailed out and other things like the repeal of the gold standard and other stuff. I mean, those are just a couple examples. There's probably others. You could probably just do a whole video dissertation on why Hamilton's idea, probably the wrong one, was a bad idea. And of course, eventually, Jackson, the only good thing I will say that guy did as president was paying off the national debt and then getting rid of the national bank for that time. Which Hamilton would probably be like, no! But his whole thing was that the nation needs to incur debt in order to trade with people. And as he put it, the greater the debt, the greater the credit. Which, if you've worked with credit cards, you could see it is kind of true. Is that as you go with debt, you know, buy stuff, pay stuff off, and your credit score improves, your history improves, people are more likely to lend credit, extend credit, and trust you. Even if like you're 80% there, they're going to know from your payment history and your work history, like, okay, he's good for it. So they're going with that model. And of course, Hamilton also wants the central government to incur the debt of the states, which puts him at odds with Jefferson again, because Jefferson fears that, all right, if all the people who are handling the money, especially if they're all in the North, which is other point of contention, which is kind of right, and that's one of the other issues that would eventually lead to war. I mean, people are going to say the whole states' rights and everything, but I'm just going to get off on a little side note and say that, yeah, I do say slavery is the main cause of the Civil War, but it has all these little branches that stick out from it and reconnect back. But that is its heart issue. It has all these little side branches, but when you look at them, they all connect back. Now this one, part of it, the whole North versus South and money thing, connects back to it, but you could also look at it from a non-slavery perspective, which is what this episode kind of does, whether you like that or not, because slavery is not really brought up in the episode in any form. But with here, it's just Hamilton and Jefferson having their difference of opinion and philosophy when it comes to debt. Jefferson's is to get back on that point, he doesn't think that the money people in the North, mainly like a banker, should have power because of that over a farmer in the South. And then to go back one step further, the New York banker be in debt to somebody in London. So it's like a step. And he thinks, it's like, yeah, that doesn't sound like it'd be good for the people. Whereas Hamilton is like brushing him off as like, yeah, it's for society. And combined with the argument scene we hear off camera and watch Adams react to, you can see why these two wouldn't get along. And of course, from what we see from Hamilton in this episode and the next episode, we could see why he was eventually, remember, shot in a duel? I think it was with Burr, if I remember right. I gotta look that back up. I'll have to put that in the notes for the next episode. It's like so much history stuff to remember for this one. It's like, forgive me if I forget one or two things. Like I said at the top of the video, John Adams is elected the second president at the end of this episode, and being the vice president, he is the one who has to read the votes. And of course, Paul Giamatti acts this pretty well, making it look like he reads it first and then reads it off. But even with that, when he reads his own name in the votes, you can tell he's like, oh no, let's just see what the reaction is here, because from a lot of the scenes we see in the Congress, the senators are lambasting him, calling him his rotundancy because of his belly he got in his older age. And one of them even mentions that, but even then, they do start a slow applause. You can tell some of them are being respectful, even if they don't like him. It's like, he was elected, we got to be there. Other ones are like, yeah. And then the speech he gives, part of it is to praise Washington, but also saying he's going to follow his example. And I do feel it appropriate that near the end of it, that Washington is the one that does that. More so following a scene where they have tea and discuss politics, which is before the Ambassador Janae scene. It does show that even if Adams can be a little overzealous in his thinking, like at the top of the episode where he's trying to think of other titles for the presidency, some of which are ridiculous, like His Royal Highness the President. It's like, really? And then later on he has to say Mr. President and nothing more. You can still tell that even with that, he still respects Adams enough, as we've seen their interactions in the previous episodes, and knows he is politically astute enough to give sound advice, even if he knows it's the type of advice Washington doesn't want to hear. And he might be a little overzealous, but since he respects Washington for his war service, Washington knows Adams is going to give it in a way that's not going to be unlike when Hamilton and Jefferson are in there trying to give him advice and they go to heads. So a nice little bit of respect there. And like the previous episode, Morse does portray Washington with elegance and class. And he does add a little bit of mild aggression at points here, mainly when he's upset or when he's trying to put Janae in check. But there's one line that he says when the torch is being passed from one to two and they shake hands, like, congratulations, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. The line that they have Washington say. Pretty good one. And it sums up how tired Washington probably got near the end of his terms and how Washington felt about everything involving that. And also the whole duty to your country thing. You'll serve when doing it, but when someone else comes in, it's their turn. And that is, I am fairly out. and you are fairly in. We'll see which one of us is the happier. And of course, Jefferson is the vice president here, and even though they've had their differences of opinion, as we've seen in the last couple episodes, and they are of different parties and political philosophies, Adams wants to bury the hatchet and be like, let's make a good job of it. Now, Jefferson smiles at him. There, you can read a lot into the smile, but I view it as, even though they have differences of opinion, they're old friends, and at least for the time being, they'll try to work together. This is a nice little way to end the episode, but it ends proper once John and Abigail get to their new abode, which is not clean, but not really much to say there. Now, I haven't really mentioned this in the previous episodes, but Wikipedia does have a whole big section dedicated to goofs that are present in the episodes. I really wish I'd looked over this for the previous one. I looked through it. There's only a couple here that I think are interesting to mention, like Thomas Pinckney, who is depicted as a senator, wasn't one during the time presented. That's a minor one, depending on how you view it. I think he was thrown in there because it's a name a lot of people will know, and, good to name drop him. Adams gave his inauguration speech in the House chamber to a group of senators, representatives, Supreme Court justice, department heads, and others, instead of the little room it's depicted. I think they did that just to reuse that set again, and they probably didn't want to use a lot of extras. Makes it also a little bit more informal yet formal. And of course, this is the big one from a historical standpoint, but I can understand why they did it this way for a dramatic standpoint, because it also gives Adams something to do. And that is the Jay Treaty. Adams did not have to cast a vote for it. And that was because the Jay Treaty was ratified 20-10, so it wasn't deadlocked like it's presented in the episode. But in the episode, it's done, show Adams will use what little power he has as the vice president when needed and warranted, such as when you have to do a deadlock breaking vote. And of course, he did so. And it's a nice little moment there, and good for a dramatic standpoint. But as he's going to say in a later episode, it's bad history. But that is Hollywood for you. Depending on how egregious it is, that'll let slide the kamikaze pilots attacking citizens in Pearl Harbor. No. All in all, this is a pretty good episode. Nice to show the Washington presidency. Like the previous episode, it does skip over a lot of time period to tell its story. It does have some good breathing room. Nice little bit of drama for Adams, both from home front and in the political field. And it's a nice little segue into his own term as president, which, if you thought people didn't like him before, this is when Adams is going to find out that people really are not starting to like him. Especially with some of the controversial things he's going to do, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts. But we'll find out about that next time. See ya.